Go to a nursing home, old lady. That's where you belong. My daughter's voice cut through the air, colder than the sidewalk where my boxes were being thrown. The door to my apartment, the one I bought with my late husband, slammed shut with a definitive sound, and the echo of my son's laughter still stings my ears. What they didn't imagine is what I would do in the following hours, with the smell of rain mixing with my memories. The story of how I turned the biggest humiliation of my life into my greatest victory will leave you breathless. So stick with me until the end. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from, whether it's from your couch or during a work break. It's good to know I'm not alone anymore. My name is Margaret Adler, and for 72 years, this world has known me as a woman of simple tastes. My greatest joys have always been the scent of a New York cheesecake cooling on the rack, the delicate purple of the African violets on my windowsill, and the steady, comforting tick-tock of the grandfather clock Arthur inherited from his parents. This brownstone in Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn, wasn't just a building. It was a living thing, infused with the cinnamon of 1,000 bakes and the faint, lingering smell of my late husband's wood polish. He was a union carpenter, a man whose hands were rough but whose touch was always gentle. He built the shelves in our kitchen and laid the floor in our bedroom, and every creak of the wood was like his voice whispering goodnight. That Tuesday began like any other. The morning air was thick with the promise of rain, a damp coolness seeping through the window frames. I was in the kitchen, my hands dusted with flour, preparing the graham cracker crust for an order. Mrs. Rossi from downstairs had placed for her grandson's birthday. The rhythmic thump of my rolling pin against the butcher block was the heartbeat of my morning, a meditation that connected me to Arthur, to this home, to the life we'd built with calloused hands and unwavering love. I felt a quiet contentment, the kind that settles deep in your bones after a life lived with purpose, however small it may seem to others. The peace was shattered by the sharp, insistent buzz of the intercom. It was too early for deliveries and too abrupt for a neighbor. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach as I wiped my hands on my apron and pressed the talk button. It was Richard, my son. "Mom, it's us. We need to talk. Buzz us in." His voice was flat, devoid of its usual forced cheerfulness. It was the voice he used when he was about to ask for money, a tone that always made the air in the room grow thin and cold. I buzzed them in, a silent prayer forming in my mind that this wouldn't be another one of his failed investment schemes. They stood in my doorway, Richard and Patricia, looking like strangers. He, in a suit that was just a little too tight, smelling of desperation and cheap cologne. She, with her perfectly styled hair and a designer handbag clutched like a shield, her eyes scanning my apartment with a familiar flicker of disdain. It was her gaze that landed the first blow. Even before she spoke, it swept over Arthur's photographs, my worn-out armchair, the stacks of baking magazines, and dismissed it all as old and worthless. Then came the words, the ones that splintered the foundation of my world. After they explained the sale, the papers, the betrayal, I just stood there, speechless. Patricia sighed, a puff of annoyed air. "Enough with the drama, Mom. Go to a nursing home, you old woman. That's where you belong." The words hung in the air, sharper than any knife. You old woman. It wasn't just an insult. It was a verdict. They had judged me, found me irrelevant, and sentenced me to be discarded. Richard wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at the folder in his hands, a cheap manila folder that apparently held the deed to my entire life. "Mom, it's for the best," he mumbled, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed. "The market is good. We can invest the money for you. Make sure you're taken care of." Taken care of. Like a piece of furniture to be put into storage. I looked from my son's averted gaze to my daughter's hardened face. There was no empathy there, only a chilling pragmatism. I remembered a time when that same face, small and round, would look up at me with absolute trust as I taught her how to crimp the edges of a pie crust. Where did that little girl go? When did her heart become as cold and hard as a frozen stick of butter? The smell of cinnamon and vanilla from my kitchen suddenly felt cloying, like the scent of wilting funeral flowers. This place, my sanctuary, was being poisoned by their presence. My mind raced back a few months, to the day Richard brought the papers to my apartment. He'd been so charming, so concerned. "It's just to help with your Social Security and Medicare, Mom," he'd said, his pen hovering over the signature line. "Just a standard power of attorney so Patty and I can handle the paperwork if you ever get sick. It saves you the headache." I, who had always prided myself on my keen sense of observation, had been blinded by a mother's foolish trust. I had signed my life away on my own kitchen table, right next to a cooling cheesecake. The irony was so bitter it made my throat ache. I had spent my life nurturing them, baking their favorite cakes for birthdays, slipping them money when they were struggling, and in return, they saw me not as their mother, but as a final asset to be liquidated. I saw now that their sporadic visits weren't born of affection, but of assessment. They were vultures circling, waiting for the right moment to strike, and they had decided that moment was now. I still hadn't processed it all when Richard took a step forward, and I saw the look in his eyes wasn't just greed, it was fear. I just didn't understand what he was so afraid of yet. "We've already started the process," Patricia said, her voice sharp, pulling me from my daze. She gestured toward the door as if expecting me to simply pack a bag and leave. "The new owners want to take possession by the end of the month. We've hired movers for this afternoon to take some of your essential things to the facility." The facility. She couldn't even bring herself to say nursing home again, not after seeing the impact of her first verbal blow. The word was clinical, sterile, erasing any hint of humanity from the place they intended to send me to die. I finally found my voice, though it came out as a ragged whisper. "This is my home. Arthur and I. We bought this place with 30 years of his sweat and my flour-dusted hands. You can't just sell it." My protest sounded feeble even to my own ears. It was a plea from a world with rules of love and loyalty, a world they no longer inhabited. They were operating under a different set of laws now, the laws of the market, of opportunity, of ruthless self-interest. The rain began to patter against the window pane, a soft, mournful drumbeat accompanying the demolition of my life. Richard shifted his weight, the floorboards groaning under him. It was a sound I knew well, a spot Arthur had always meant to fix. "The documents are legal, Mom. We have the right." He said it quietly, as if ashamed, but the words were a steel wall. Legality had replaced morality. A signature I'd given in trust had become their weapon, and they were wielding it without a flicker of remorse. I looked at the grandfather clock, its pendulum swinging back and forth, steady and indifferent, measuring out the final minutes of my life in this house. Patricia, ever the practical one, walked over to my china cabinet, the one that held my grandmother's porcelain tea set from Germany. She opened the glass door and ran a manicured finger over a delicate, hand-painted cup. "We'll have to sell most of this," she declared to the room. "The facility doesn't have much space, and this old stuff is just clutter." Clutter, my grandmother's memory, the story of her journey from a war-torn country with nothing but this tea set, reduced to clutter. Each word was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I felt a sudden, dizzying wave of anger, so potent it almost buckled my knees. It was a foreign feeling. I was a woman of patience, of slow-rising dough and gentle heat. But this cold, calculated cruelty was something I couldn't comprehend. I wanted to scream, to throw that precious teacup against the wall and watch it shatter into 1,000 pieces, just like my heart. But I didn't. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my silence my only defense, my mind a whirlwind of disbelief and a nascent, unfamiliar rage. "Please," I said, the word cracking. "Don't do this." It was the last time I would beg them for anything. Patricia turned from the cabinet, her expression unmoved. "It's already done," she said. "The movers will be here at 2. She looked at her expensive watch, a clear signal that her time here, and my time here, was running out. The finality in her voice was absolute, leaving no room for argument or appeal. It was a business transaction, and I was the inventory being cleared out. I watched them as they moved through my home, pointing at things, discussing what to keep and what to discard. They were like ghosts from a terrible future, walking through the museum of my past and tagging items for disposal. My wedding album on the coffee table, Arthur's favorite reading lamp, the quilt I had spent an entire winter stitching by hand. None of it mattered to them. They were erasing me, systematically, from the only place I had ever truly belonged. As Patricia spoke about managing my assets, a sudden, sharp memory of Arthur flashed in my mind. He was sitting at this very kitchen table, years ago, tapping a loose floorboard under the sink with his hammer. He had looked up at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and given me a slow, deliberate wink before nailing it shut. "For a rainy day, Maggie," he'd whispered. At the time, I thought he was just being sentimental. I had no idea that simple, hidden act held the key to my entire future. The movers arrived exactly at 2. 2 large men who looked apologetic but firm. They didn't speak much, just followed Richard's curt instructions. They started in the living room, their heavy boots scuffing the wooden floors Arthur had so carefully polished every Sunday. The first thing they packed was the box of my recipe books, decades of handwritten notes and adjustments, stained with vanilla and butter. It felt like they were packing up my soul, taping it shut in a brown cardboard box. I watched from my armchair, unable to move, a silent statue in the chaos. Mrs. Rossi must have heard the commotion because I saw her face appear in her window across the courtyard, her expression a mixture of confusion and horror. She raised a hand as if to ask if I was okay, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. How could I explain this? That the children I had raised were evicting me. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Patricia directed the movers with an unnerving efficiency, a general commanding an invasion. "Just the personal items," she instructed them. "The furniture stays for the new owners." The thought of strangers sleeping in my bed, eating at my table, looking out my window. It was a violation too profound to fully grasp. My home, my life, had become a staged set, and my part in the play was over. Richard stayed by the door, his phone pressed to his ear, pretending to be on an important business call, avoiding the destruction he had set in motion. The men were careful, but their movements were impersonal. They wrapped my grandmother's tea set in newspaper and placed it in a box labeled, "Kitchen, Fragile." They took the photographs from the walls, leaving pale, dusty rectangles where memories used to hang. Each empty space was a fresh wound. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to grow louder, more ominous, counting down not just the hours, but the end of an era. The rain outside was heavier now, lashing against the glass, mirroring the storm inside me. I thought about Arthur. What would he have done? He was a quiet man, but he had a spine of steel. He never backed down from a fight when it came to protecting his family. But what do you do when the fight is with your family? How do you protect yourself from your own children? The betrayal was a complex, tangled knot of grief and anger that I couldn't begin to unravel. He would have been heartbroken. He would have been furious. They worked quickly. Within an hour, the living room was almost bare, and a small, pathetic pile of cardboard boxes stood by the door. My life, condensed into a few dozen cubic feet. Patricia came over to me, her car keys jingling in her hand. "We'll take you over now," she said, not as a question, but as a command. "It's better to get it over with. Get it over with, like a painful but necessary medical procedure." The movers carried the first box out, the one with Arthur's old carpentry tools. I heard it scrape against the doorframe, a harsh, grating sound that felt like it was tearing through my own skin. The sound of my life being dismantled, piece by painful piece. At that moment, watching them carry away the last tangible pieces of my husband, something inside me shifted. The shock and the grief receded, and in their place, a cold, terrifying calm settled in my heart. They thought this was an ending, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was just the beginning of their reckoning. They led me out of the apartment and down the stairs. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The door to my home, the one Arthur had installed himself, clicked shut behind me for the last time. On the sidewalk, under the gray, weeping sky, they placed the boxes. The rain began to soak into the cardboard, blurring the black marker labels. Patricia gave my arm a brief, awkward pat. "Someone from the home will be here soon to pick you up," she said, already backing away toward her car. And then they were gone, leaving me on the sidewalk with the remnants of my life, a 72-year-old woman with nothing but the clothes on her back and a secret buried beneath her kitchen floor. The rain wasn't just water. It was a cold, liquid judgment, plastering my thin cardigan to my skin and seeping into the cardboard boxes that held my life. I sat on the stoop, the one I used to scrub every Saturday morning, and watched the taillights of Patricia's expensive sedan disappear around the corner. The street was quiet, except for the hiss of tires on wet asphalt and the mournful drip from the awning above. Mrs. Rossi was still at her window, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a pity that felt almost as sharp as my children's cruelty. I was a spectacle, the neighborhood's sad, cautionary tale, and the shame was a physical weight pushing my shoulders toward the wet concrete. A nondescript black car pulled up to the curb, its engine humming with a sterile efficiency that made my stomach clench. A man in a cheap polo shirt with a logo I couldn't make out got out, an umbrella in one hand and a clipboard in the other. He approached me with a practiced, weary kindness. "Margaret Adler?" he asked, his voice flat. I could only nod. "I'm from the Golden Years residence. We're here to take you to your new home." He said, "home," as if the word had no meaning, just a sound he was paid to make. He and another man began loading my soggy boxes into the trunk, their movements brisk and impersonal. I didn't want to move. Every muscle in my body felt frozen, locked in protest. This couldn't be happening. If I just sat here long enough, maybe Arthur would come down the steps, wipe the rain from my face, and tell me it was all a bad dream. But Arthur was gone, and the only hand offered to me was that of a stranger whose job was to ferry the unwanted to their final sterile waiting room. He gently touched my elbow. "Come on, ma'am. Let's get you out of the rain." The touch was the final indignity, a professional courtesy that underscored my complete and utter helplessness. I let him guide me into the back of the car. The car smelled of pine-scented air freshener and something vaguely medicinal, a scent designed to cover up the smell of old age and despair. The vinyl seats were cold and sticky against my skin. As we pulled away from the curb, I looked back at my brownstone one last time. My violets were still on the windowsill, their purple heads drooping in the rain. Forgotten. They would die without me. The thought was so simple, so devastating. It finally broke through the shock. My children hadn't just thrown me away. They had condemned every living thing I cared for. The driver, trying to be helpful, started a cheerful monologue about the facility's weekly bingo night. His voice droned on, a meaningless buzz in the background of my silent agony. He mentioned something about the food being not half bad and the nurses being very attentive. It was when he said, "You'll be safe and dry there, especially on a rainy day like this," that something inside my mind snapped into focus. A rainy day. The phrase echoed, not in the driver's bland tone, but in Arthur's low, warm whisper from decades ago. I could see him so clearly, kneeling on the kitchen floor, his hammer in hand, giving me that slow, secret wink. "For a rainy day, Maggie," he'd said, nailing a single, specific floorboard shut under the sink. It wasn't just a memory. It was a jolt, an electric shock that shot through the numbness. Arthur wasn't just fixing a loose board. He was a meticulous man, a carpenter who saw the world in angles and plans. There was nothing random about his work. It was a message, a secret he had left for me, hidden in plain sight. This, right here, this moment of absolute ruin, with the rain pouring down and my life in soggy boxes, this was the rainy day he had prepared for. The realization was so powerful, so blindingly clear, that I gasped, sucking in the stale, pine-scented air. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed with concern. "You all right back there, ma'am?" I couldn't answer. My mind was no longer in the car. It was back in my kitchen, calculating, remembering. Arthur had been a union man his whole life, proud of his work, but deeply distrustful of banks and institutions after his own father lost everything in the Great Depression. He always said the safest bank was the one you built yourself. I had always thought he meant the house itself, the solid brick and mortar, but he meant something more, something hidden. A new feeling began to displace the grief. It was cold and sharp, like an icicle forming in my chest. It was anger, but not the hot, helpless kind I'd felt earlier. This was a focused, purposeful rage. They had underestimated me. They saw a frail old baker, a woman who could be easily swindled and discarded. They had no idea I was Arthur Adler's wife. They had no idea what that meant. I still wasn't sure what it meant, but I knew, with a certainty that made my hands stop trembling, that my story wasn't over. I knew I couldn't let them take me to that residence. "Stop the car," I said, my voice surprisingly firm. The driver looked back, confused. "Ma'am, you have to take me back," I insisted, the plan forming as I spoke. I forgot my medication, my heart pills. I can't be without them, not even for one night. It was a lie, of course. My heart was as strong as a horse, stubbornly beating despite everything. But it was a believable lie, the kind of thing an old woman would forget in a moment of crisis. The driver sighed, a long, put-upon sound. "We're almost there. Can't they provide you with some at the facility?" I pressed my hand to my chest, channeling every ounce of theatricality I possessed. "No, it's a special prescription, very high dosage. My doctor, he said it's critical." I let my voice tremble just enough. I hated the deception, the performance of weakness, but it was a means to an end. This was no longer a matter of pride. It was a matter of survival. The driver muttered something under his breath about his schedule, about the paperwork, but he made a U-turn at the next intersection. The car was now heading back to Carroll Gardens, back to my home. Every block we drove felt like an eternity. What if the new owners were already there? What if Richard had changed the locks? My mind raced through a dozen disastrous scenarios. I clutched my purse on my lap, my knuckles white. Inside it, nestled amongst old tissues and a tube of lipstick, was my key ring. In their haste to evict me, in their arrogant assumption of my complete defeat, they had forgotten the most basic thing. They had taken the deed, but they had left me the key. It was a small, stupid mistake, but it was the only opening I needed. The car pulled up in front of the brownstone again. The street was empty now. Even Mrs. Rossi had retreated from her window. The rain had softened to a fine mist. "I'll be right back," I told the driver, my voice steady despite the frantic pounding in my chest. "Please, don't leave." He gave a resigned nod, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. I walked up the 3 steps to the front door, my legs feeling strangely light. My hand was shaking as I sorted through the keys, the familiar jingle a sound from another lifetime. I found the right one, the brass worn smooth from 50 years of use. I slid it into the lock. It turned. The apartment was silent and hollow. The movers had left dents in the carpet and dust outlines on the walls where my pictures used to hang. The air smelled of wet cardboard and emptiness. It was a ghost of a home, and for a moment, the grief washed over me again. So strong it almost brought me to my knees. But I didn't have time for grief. I walked straight through the living room and into the kitchen, my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The grandfather clock had stopped ticking. They must have jostled it when they moved the furniture. The silence was deafening. I knelt, my old knees protesting, and reached under the kitchen sink, pushing aside a bottle of dish soap they had overlooked. My fingers traced the familiar lines of the wooden floorboards. 1, 2, 3 from the left. I pressed down. It was firm. My heart sank. Had I imagined it? Was it just the desperate fantasy of a broken mind? I pressed again, harder this time, remembering how Arthur would put his whole weight into it. There was a faint click, and the edge of the board lifted by less than a millimeter. It was real. With trembling fingers, I searched the utensil drawer. They had taken the silverware, but a single, forgotten butter knife lay at the back. It was all I needed. I wedged the tip into the tiny gap and pried. The board resisted for a moment, then came up with a soft groan of old wood. There, nestled in the dark, dusty space between the joists, was a small, heavy metal box, wrapped in oilcloth. It was an old army ammunition box, the kind Arthur would have used in his service days. It was cold and solid in my hands. The lock was simple, just a latch. I lifted it. My breath held tight in my chest. The lid creaked open. Inside, it didn't look like much at first. There were stacks of old United States savings bonds, bundled with twine, their paper yellowed with age. There was a deed, folded neatly, to a small parcel of land near Jamaica Bay in Queens, a place I didn't even know he owned. And underneath it all was a small, dark blue, leather-bound passbook. It wasn't from a local Brooklyn bank. The lettering on the front was crisp and gold, Credit Suisse. I opened the passbook. The last entry was dated just a month before Arthur died. He had been making small, steady deposits for over 40 years, a portion of every side job he ever did. The cash he earned fixing a neighbor's porch or building a cabinet for a friend. He had been quietly, secretly investing it, letting it grow in a place he believed was safe from everything. The final balance at the bottom of the page was a number so large, so impossible, it didn't seem real. It was a fortune built from sawdust and sweat, a quiet man's secret rebellion against a world he never fully trusted. I closed the book, the leather cool against my fingertips. I could feel Arthur's presence in the room, not as a ghost, but as a force, a quiet strength that was now mine to wield. I thought of Patricia's sneering face, of Richard's averted eyes. "Go to a nursing home, you old woman," she had said. They thought they were writing the last chapter of my life. They had no idea I was about to buy the whole library. I stood up, my knees no longer aching, and tucked the passbook securely into my purse. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving the floorboard open and the empty box on the counter. It didn't matter anymore. I paused at the grandfather clock and gently pushed the pendulum. It began to swing, its steady, rhythmic ticking once again filling the silence of the room. It was the sound of my heart, beating strong and even. It was the sound of time starting again, but on my terms. I had walked back into this apartment a victim. I was walking out a general. When I got back into the car, the driver looked surprised at how quickly I'd returned. "Find your pills?" he asked, his voice tinged with impatience. I gave him a small, serene smile that I knew he couldn't possibly understand. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and calm. "I found exactly what I needed." He grunted and put the car in drive, ready to take me to the Golden Years residence. I let him. For now, it would be a quiet place to think, to plan. As we drove away a second time, I didn't look back. There was no need. I was no longer looking at the past. I was looking at the future, a future they had tried to steal from me. The rain had stopped completely, and a sliver of pale afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, reflecting off the wet pavement. It looked like the whole city was being washed clean, polished, and waiting for me to make my first move. They had left me on the sidewalk to be rained on, to be forgotten. They thought they had taken everything. But they had forgotten about Arthur. They had forgotten about his love, his foresight, and the rainy day he had spent a lifetime preparing me for. And most of all, they had forgotten who I was. A woman who knew that the secret to a perfect cheesecake and to a perfect revenge was patience. And I had all the time and all the money in the world. My first call would not be to a lawyer. It would be to an old friend of Arthur's from the Union, a man who now ran one of the most aggressive real estate investment firms in the city. I remembered his name perfectly. They had wanted to liquidate an asset. I was about to show them what a real liquidation looked like, starting with every single thing they owned. The car pulled into the circular driveway of the Golden Years residence, a sterile brick building that looked more like a hospital than a home. The driver turned to me. "Well, here we are." I looked at the manicured lawns and the blank windows, and I felt no fear, no despair. I felt only a profound, chilling sense of purpose. "Thank you," I said, my voice smooth as silk. "This will do just fine as a temporary headquarters. My first 24 hours in the Golden Years residence felt like a lifetime spent in purgatory. The air was a sterile cocktail of bleach and boiled vegetables, a stark contrast to the warm, yeasty scent of my own kitchen. My room was a beige box with a window that overlooked a parking lot, a far cry from the vibrant Brooklyn streetscape I had known. In this place, I was no longer Margaret Adler, the baker, the wife, the mother. I was just another resident, a name on a chart, my life reduced to a schedule of meals and medication distribution. The condescending cheerfulness of the staff was almost worse than my children's overt cruelty. It was a slow-acting poison of pity. On the second day, I found the small, dusty library. It was mostly filled with large-print romance novels and outdated encyclopedias, but it had a desk and, most importantly, a payphone that offered a sliver of privacy. My hands trembled as I took out the small piece of paper where I'd written the number for Leo Grossman, Arthur's old friend from the Carpenters Union. Arthur had always said, "If you're ever in a real jam, Leo's the guy. He's sharp as a tack and tougher than a $2 steak." I fed my coins into the slot, my heart hammering against my ribs, and dialed the number to his real estate investment firm. A crisp, professional voice answered, "Grossman Holdings." I asked for Leo, and after a long, skeptical pause, I was put through. His voice was gravelly, older but still sharp. "Leo Grossman speaking." I took a deep breath. "Leo, this is Margaret Adler, Arthur's wife." There was a moment of silence on the other end, and then a warm, "Maggie? My God, it's been years. How are you?" The kindness in his voice almost broke me, but I held it together. I started to explain my situation, the words tumbling out in a rushed, desperate torrent. The sale, the power of attorney, the nursing home. I sounded exactly like what I was, a hysterical old woman. He listened patiently, but I could hear the shift in his tone from warmth to cautious concern. When I got to the part about the money Arthur had left, the Swiss bank account, his voice became guarded. "Maggie, are you sure about this? Sometimes, after a shock, things can get confused." He didn't say the word senile, but it hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. He politely promised to look into it and ended the call. I hung up the phone, the receiver slick with my own sweat. The first step had been a stumble. I hadn't sounded like a woman with a fortune. I had sounded like a woman who had lost her mind. That night, sleep was impossible. The thin mattress felt like a slab of concrete, and the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system was a constant reminder of my sterile prison. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Leo's doubtful voice echoing in my head. He was right. Why would anyone believe me? I was a baker. My expertise was in the precise chemistry of flour, sugar, and yeast, not international finance. The old Margaret would have given up right there, would have accepted her fate and faded away into the beige walls of the residence. But the thought of Patricia's smug face and Richard's weak-willed betrayal was a fire in my gut that wouldn't be extinguished. The next morning, I woke up with a new resolve. If I was going to fight this war, I needed a new set of skills. I started with what I knew. Recipes. A good recipe requires precision, patience, and a clear understanding of every single ingredient. My plan for revenge would be no different. I went back to the library, but this time I ignored the novels. I found an old set of business encyclopedias and started reading. I looked up terms I'd heard on the news: shell corporations, asset management, capital gains. My brain, so used to calculating baking times and ingredient ratios, ached with the effort, but I pushed on. My days fell into a new routine. I would attend the mandatory meals, nodding politely to the other residents, a ghost in their midst. But the rest of my time was my own. I spent hours in the library, filling a small notebook with my research. I learned about international banking laws, about how to discreetly transfer funds, about the complex world of New York real estate. The nurses would peer in, offering me a cup of tea with a patronizing smile. "Don't strain yourself, dear," one of them said one afternoon, patting my hand. A good nap is better for you than all those dusty old books. I just smiled back, the fire in my belly burning a little hotter. They saw a frail old woman. I was forging armor. The biggest conflict wasn't with the staff or the books. It was with myself. There were moments of crippling doubt, usually late at night, when the old Margaret would whisper in my ear, "Who are you kidding? You're a 72-year-old woman in a nursing home. What can you possibly do?" I would look at my hands, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, the skin thin and papery, and see only the hands of a baker, not a warrior. I was terrified of failing, of proving my children right, of truly becoming the helpless, irrelevant old woman they believed me to be. It was in those moments that I would clutch the cool leather of Arthur's passbook, hidden under my mattress, and feel his quiet, steady strength flowing back into me. After a week of intense study, I knew I was ready to try again. I couldn't use the payphone. I needed to project an aura of authority, not desperation. I found a younger, tech-savvy aide and paid him $50 to help me buy a simple burner phone from a corner store. The transaction felt illicit, clandestine, a world away from buying flour and sugar at the local market. Holding the small, anonymous device in my hand gave me a strange thrill. It was the first tool of my new life, a weapon they would never see coming. I was no longer just a resident. I was an operative behind enemy lines. My second call to Leo Grossman was entirely different. I didn't wait for him to ask questions. I started with the account number from the Credit Suisse passbook and the name of the private banker in Zurich that Arthur had listed. I spoke calmly, using the terms I had learned. I talked about asset liquidation and discrete wire transfers. I didn't plead or cry. I gave instructions. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. When Leo finally spoke, all the cautious pity was gone from his voice. It was replaced with a single, astonished word, Maggie. It was as if he was meeting me for the first time. "I need to meet with you, Leo," I said, my voice even and firm. "In your office, tomorrow afternoon." This was the real test. If he treated me like a client, I had a chance. If he suggested meeting at the nursing home, it was over. He hesitated for only a second. "Of course, Maggie. My driver will pick you up at 1 o'clock. Just tell me where." The relief was so profound it almost made my knees buckle. I gave him the address of a small coffee shop 2 blocks from the residence, not wanting his fancy car pulling up to the front doors of my gilded cage. I had won the first battle. The next day, I prepared for the meeting like a general preparing for war. I used some of the cash Arthur had tucked into the metal box to buy a simple but elegant navy blue dress from a small boutique I'd slipped out to visit. It was a far cry from my usual aprons and cardigans. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger staring back at me. Her hair was neatly coiffed, her posture was straight, and her eyes held a glint of steel I hadn't seen in decades. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by a powerful, unfamiliar sense of purpose. I was no longer just Arthur's widow. I was his legacy. Leo's driver, a quiet man in a black suit, was waiting for me exactly at 1. The car was a sleek, black Mercedes, its leather interior smelling of wealth and power. As we drove through the familiar streets of Brooklyn towards Manhattan, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie of someone else's life. The world outside the tinted windows seemed to move at a different pace. People were rushing to work, grabbing lunch, living their lives, completely unaware of the quiet revolution being staged in the back of this car. This was a world I had never been a part of, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was about to own a piece of it. Grossman Holdings was on one of the top floors of a skyscraper that pierced the clouds. The office was a silent expanse of glass, steel, and dark wood. From his window, you could see the whole of Lower Manhattan spread out like a map. Leo greeted me at the door himself, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He was older, grayer, but the sharp intelligence in his gaze was undiminished. He led me to a massive mahogany conference table, and for the first time, he looked not at a friend's grieving widow, but at a woman of immense, unexpected power. He had done his homework. A folder lay on the table between us. "The account is real, Maggie," he said, his voice low, "and the balance is substantial." Arthur was a very, very smart man. He slid a document across the table. It was a confirmation from the Swiss bank. Seeing the number printed in stark black ink on official letterhead made it finally, irrevocably real. It wasn't just a memory or a desperate dream. It was capital. It was leverage. It was power. I simply nodded, refusing to let the shock show on my face, determined to maintain the calm authority I had practiced. For the next 2 hours, Leo laid out the complexities. Buying back my building wouldn't be simple. It was now owned by a development corporation. They would have to set up a new anonymous LLC to make the purchase offer. It would involve lawyers, accountants, and a strategy far more intricate than simply writing a check. "This is a Shark Tank, Maggie," he warned, his eyes serious. "These people will eat you alive if they sense a drop of blood in the water. Are you sure you're ready for this?" He was testing me, wanting to know if the woman before him was as strong as the bank account she represented. I looked out the window at the city below, at the millions of lives intersecting and colliding. I thought of my small apartment, my violets, the smell of my cheesecakes, the life that had been stolen from me with a signature and a cruel word. I had been pushed out of my world, deemed worthless, but they didn't realize they had pushed me into a new one, a world where money was a weapon and I was finally learning how to use it. I turned my gaze back to Leo, my expression unyielding. "They've already seen my blood, Leo," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the glass in front of me. "Now, they're going to see what I can do with it." A slow smile spread across Leo's face. It was the smile of a man who loved a good fight. "All right, Maggie," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Let's go to war." He explained that the first step was to form the company that would act as our vehicle. He asked what I wanted to call it. I didn't have to think for a second. "Hearthstone Properties LLC," I said. Hearthstone, the stone at the heart of a home, the foundation. It was for Arthur. It was for the home they took. It was a promise of everything I intended to build from the ashes of my old life. The drive back to the residence felt different. The fear and uncertainty had been replaced by a clear, cold sense of direction. I had an ally, I had a plan, and I had the resources to see it through. When the driver dropped me off at the coffee shop, I walked the 2 blocks back to Golden Years, not as a prisoner returning to her cell, but as a queen returning to her command center. The beige walls no longer seemed oppressive. They were merely a temporary inconvenience, a camouflage for the work I had to do. My transformation was no longer just an idea. It was a tangible reality. That evening, a letter was waiting for me at the front desk. It was from Patricia. I opened it with steady hands. It was a short, condescending note filled with hollow pleasantries. She hoped I was settling in and making friends. She mentioned that she and Richard had invested the proceeds from the sale wisely to ensure my future care was covered. The hypocrisy was so blatant, it was almost comical. She ended the letter with a final, patronizing flourish. "Just relax and let us handle things now, Mom. It's for the best." I folded the letter neatly and placed it in my notebook. It was fuel. It was a reminder of why I couldn't stop, why I couldn't fail. I sat on my bed, the city lights beginning to twinkle outside my window. For weeks, I had been consumed by grief and shock. I had mourned the loss of my home, my life, and the children I thought I knew. But as I sat there in the sterile quiet of my room, I realized that the woman who had been left on the sidewalk in the rain was gone. In her place was someone else, someone I was just beginning to know. She was a woman who understood the language of power, who was not afraid of a fight, and who knew that revenge, like a perfect cheesecake, is a dish best served cold. I picked up my new phone and sent a short, simple text to Leo. "Greenlight Hearthstone, begin phase 1. The reply came back almost instantly. "Welcome to the game, Maggie." A small, grim smile touched my lips. My children had wanted to close the book on my life, to write me into a sad, pathetic ending. They had no idea that I was the author of this story, and I was just getting to the most interesting chapter. The journey of transformation was complete. The journey of retribution was about to begin. The weeks that followed my meeting with Leo were a masterclass in calculated patience, a virtue I had honed over a lifetime of baking. From my small, beige room at the Golden Years residence, I became the silent, invisible CEO of Hearthstone Properties, LLC. Leo and his team worked with breathtaking efficiency, setting up the corporate shell, opening the necessary accounts, and moving Arthur's legacy from the quiet safety of a Swiss vault into the aggressive, fast-paced world of New York real estate. I spent my days studying market analyses and legal documents, the fine print as intricate as any lace pattern, my nights on the burner phone with Leo, making decisions that made my old life feel like a distant, black and white photograph. The old Margaret would have been paralyzed by the sheer scale of it all, by the millions of dollars that were now just numbers on a page. She would have deferred to the experts, too timid to voice an opinion, but that woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that these numbers were not just money, they were ammunition. I questioned every assumption, every piece of advice from Leo's young, brilliant associates. I learned their language, the cold calculus of cap rates and closing costs, and I found that the same meticulous attention to detail required for a perfect cheesecake was just as essential for a hostile takeover. The first move was a quiet one. Through a third-party broker, Hearthstone Properties made an unsolicited, all-cash offer for the Brownstone and Carroll Gardens. It was a generous offer, well above the price my children had sold it for, designed to be too good for the new development corporation to ignore. The days of waiting for their response were the longest of my life. I would sit by my window, watching the cars in the parking lot, my stomach in a tight, anxious knot. It was one thing to have a plan. It was another to see if the world would bend to it. The fear of failure was a constant, cold companion. The developers, greedy and seeing an easy flip, didn't just accept. They countered, asking for an even more astronomical sum. Leo called me, his voice cautious. "This is where it gets risky, Maggie. They smell a desperate buyer. We can walk away, find another investment." I looked around my sterile room, at the faded floral wallpaper and the scent of antiseptic cleaner in the air. Walking away was not an option. This wasn't just an investment, it was a reclamation. This was about more than bricks and mortar. It was about my name, Arthur's memory, and the very ground I was supposed to call home. "No," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "We don't walk away, we double down." I instructed him to accept their counteroffer without hesitation and to add a clause for an expedited 10-day closing. I wanted it done before they had time to second-guess the deal, before they could get curious about the identity of this mysterious, aggressive new player in the market. The move was audacious, bordering on reckless, but I knew in my bones it was the right one. It was a power play, a signal that Hearthstone Properties was not a company to be trifled with. Leo was silent for a moment, then let out a low whistle of admiration. The transformation was no longer just internal. I started carrying myself differently within the walls of the residence. The other residents, who had once looked at me with pity, now saw something else in my eyes. A focus, a purpose. The staff, used to my quiet compliance, were taken aback when I began making firm requests instead of polite inquiries. I was no longer just waiting to die. I was managing an empire, albeit from a room with a single bed and a view of a parking lot. The contrast was stark. The frail old woman my children discarded was now commanding a multi-million-dollar real estate transaction. The 10 days until closing were a blur of phone calls, wire transfers, and legal jargon. I barely slept, my mind racing with possibilities, both triumphant and disastrous. On the final day, I sat in the residence's library, the phone pressed to my ear, waiting for Leo's call. The grandfather clock in my old apartment had been sold with the furnishings, but I could still hear its steady ticking in my mind, counting down the seconds to my future. When the phone finally rang, my hand was so slick with sweat I almost dropped it. I answered, my throat too dry to speak. "It's done, Maggie." Leo's voice was calm, but I could hear the undercurrent of victory in it. As of 10 minutes ago, Hearthstone Properties LLC is the sole owner of 437 President Street. The building is yours. A wave of emotion so powerful it stole my breath washed over me. It wasn't just joy, it was a profound, earth-shattering sense of justice. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had been dusted with flour just a few weeks ago, and I saw not the hands of a victim, but the hands of a victor. I had done it. Arthur and I had done it. My first act as the new owner was cold, swift, and executed with legal precision. Leo's firm sent out formal notices to every tenant in the building. They were standard, impersonal letters informing them of the change in ownership and the new management protocols, all but one. For the penthouse apartment, the one my children had so generously allocated to themselves after the sale, I had Leo draft a different kind of letter. It was a notice of lease termination, giving them 30 days to vacate the premises. There was no emotion in it, just the blunt, irrefutable force of the law. I arranged to have that specific notice delivered by a process server on a Saturday morning, a time I knew they would both be home. I was there, sitting in an unremarkable car parked across the street, a block away. I watched as the server handed the envelope to Richard, saw the confused look on his face, followed by the slow, dawning horror as he and Patricia read the document together on their balcony. Their shock was a tangible thing, a wave of energy I could feel even from a distance. They had no idea who Hearthstone Properties was, but they knew their world had just been turned upside down. Their panic was immediate. My burner phone, which had been silent for days, began to ring incessantly. Richard, Patricia, Richard again. I let it ring, listening to the frantic buzz, a sound that was sweeter than any symphony. They left desperate, rambling voicemails, first angry, then pleading. They had called the management company, demanding to know who the new owner was, only to be met with a corporate stone wall. They were trapped, powerless, experiencing for the first time the same helpless terror they had inflicted upon me. The next day, I returned to the brownstone, not as a visitor, but as its owner. I used my old key, which still worked, and let myself in. The building was quiet. I walked up the stairs, my heels clicking on the polished wood, each step an affirmation of my return. I saw Mrs. Rossi in the hallway, and the look of astonished, joyous recognition on her face was a balm to my soul. "Margaret," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "We thought you were gone." I simply smiled and squeezed her hand. "I was just away on business, my dear," I told her. The confrontation I had both dreaded and craved came as I was standing in the doorway of my old apartment. Richard and Patricia came storming down the stairs, their faces pale and drawn. They stopped dead when they saw me. For a moment, they just stared, their minds unable to process the impossible reality in front of them. It was Patricia who found her voice first, a choked, disbelieving whisper. "Mom, what are you doing here? You can't be here." Her arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, animal fear. "On the contrary, Patricia," I said, my voice calm and even, a tone I had practiced in the mirror for this very moment. "I'm the one who gets to decide who can and cannot be here now." I held up the keys to the entire building, dangling them from my finger. "Hearthstone Properties sends its regards." The color drained from Richard's face. He finally understood. "Hearthstone, that's you," he stammered, pointing a trembling finger at me. You bought the building?" The question was so absurd, so pathetic. It was almost laughable. I didn't need to answer. The truth was written all over my face, in the unyielding set of my jaw and the cold fire in my eyes. They had seen me as a frail, senile old woman, a relic to be discarded. Now they saw me for what I had become, the architect of their ruin, the woman who owned the roof over their heads and held their future in the palm of her hand. They started to babble, a pathetic cascade of excuses and apologies, but their words were meaningless. They weren't sorry for what they had done. They were terrified of what I was about to do. "You have 30 days, I said, cutting through their pleas. My voice was not cruel, but it was absolute as final as a judge's gavel. I suggest you start packing. I turned my back on them then, a gesture of finality, and walked into my apartment, closing the door on their shocked faces. The click of the lock was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a chapter ending, and a new one beginning, entirely on my own terms. My home was mine again. The apartment was empty, a hollow shell stripped of my life's belongings. But it didn't feel empty. It felt full of potential, a blank canvas waiting for me to paint a new life. I walked to the window and looked out at the street, at the familiar rhythm of my neighborhood. I was home. But I was not the same woman who had been dragged from this place. That Margaret had been a gentle soul who believed in the inherent goodness of her family. This Margaret was a realist, a survivor who understood that true strength wasn't just in loving, but in defending what you love. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild. I didn't just restore my apartment, I improved it. I hired the best contractors, installed a new gourmet kitchen, and filled the rooms with furniture that was chosen by me, for me. The old grandfather clock was gone, but I bought a beautiful, modern timepiece to take its place. Its chime was a clear, bright sound that didn't measure the past, but celebrated the present. I started baking again, not for orders, but for the pleasure of it, filling my home with the warm, comforting scent of cinnamon and vanilla. My relationship with my children is severed. They moved out, their lives upended by the consequences of their own greed. I hear about them sometimes through the grapevine, about their struggles and their fall from grace. I feel a distant, clinical sadness for the children I once loved, but I feel no guilt for the decision I made. They had taught me a brutal lesson about trust, and in doing so, had forced me to learn an invaluable lesson about myself. They had intended to put me in a home, but instead, they had shown me how to build an empire. I still live in my brownstone, but I am no longer just a resident. I am a landlady, a businesswoman, an investor. I manage Hearthstone properties with Leo's guidance, acquiring other properties, building a new legacy from the ashes of the old. Mrs. Rossi is now my building manager, and her grandson gets free cheesecake for life. We have created our own small, thriving community within these walls. One built on respect and mutual kindness, not on blood and obligation. The violets are back on my windowsill, healthier and more vibrant than ever before. Looking back, the woman who was left on the sidewalk in the rain feels like a stranger to me now. I pity her, but I am also grateful to her. Her pain was the soil from which my strength grew. Her humiliation was the fire that forged my resolve. My children thought they were throwing away something old and useless, but they had no idea that what they were really doing was setting something powerful free. They wanted to erase my story, to write a pathetic final chapter for me in a sterile room. But what they failed to understand is that you can't erase a person's worth just by telling them they're worthless. You can't discard a life and expect it to simply disappear. Sometimes, the greatest transformations come from the deepest betrayals. They thought my story was over, but in reality, they had just given me the reason to write a much better one. A story not about what was taken from me, but about everything I had the strength to take back. My journey was a painful one, a trial by fire that I wouldn't wish on anyone. It forced me to confront the ugliest parts of human nature in the people I loved most. But it also revealed a strength within me I never knew I possessed. I learned that resilience isn't about never falling. It's about how you get back up, and the person you become in the process of rising. I was no longer just Margaret Adler, the baker. I was Margaret Adler, the builder. And that is a powerful lesson. It's a reminder that age is not a measure of relevance, and that a quiet life does not signify a weak spirit. There is a fire in all of us, a reserve of strength that we often don't discover until we are tested. My children's greatest mistake was in underestimating that fire. They thought they could extinguish it with a cruel word and a legal document, but all they did was fan the flames. So, this story is for anyone who has ever been made to feel small, invisible, or finished. It's for those who have been told their time is over. Your value is not determined by someone else's opinion. Your story is not theirs to write. Deep within you, there is a reserve of strength, a secret inheritance of courage, waiting for its own rainy day. Don't be afraid to find it, to use it, and to build a future they never saw coming.